This boy went missing and was never the same again. Welcome back, Charlie here. Today we're going to look at people who went missing or disappeared, only to be found sometimes years later after experiencing some horrific things. First, we have to look at Steven Stayner. On December 4th, 1972, Steven Stayner was walking home from school. That's when he was approached by two men, Irvin Murphy and Kenneth Parnell. They took Steven to Kenneth's house and held him captive, even coercing Steven into becoming Kenneth Parnell's son. Steven was only 7 years old when he was taken, but when he was 14, he decided to escape. He ran to a nearby police station and explained that he'd been missing for 7 years. Irvin Murphy and Kenneth Parnell were both arrested, and Steven was finally reunited with his family. It was very weird though, as his parents hadn't seen him since he was 7 years old. Sadly, Steven never recovered from his abduction. He struggled to adjust to normal life, and he preferred to keep his ordeal private and not talk about it too much. Sadly, when Steven was 24 years old, he passed away. This was after his motorcycle collided with a car, meaning that he only had 10 years left of his life after he escaped captivity. Next, let's look at Elizabeth Smart. In 2002, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was asleep in her bedroom. That's when she was taken by Brian Mitchell. Elizabeth's sister Mary saw the whole thing happen, but cleverly pretended to be asleep. Brian Mitchell held Elizabeth Smart captive for 9 months, but eventually Mary was able to recognize Brian Mitchell as the kidnapper, leading to his arrest. Brian Mitchell did work around the family home, meaning he was known to the family, but he had no idea that Mary saw him kidnap Elizabeth. Thankfully, Brian was arrested and Elizabeth was saved, mainly thanks to her sister Mary's quick thinking. Brian Mitchell was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Next, we have to look at Oksana Malaya. This girl was literally raised by dogs. Oksana Malaya is from Ukraine. When she was only 3 years old, her parents abandoned her in a cold field. To try and stay warm, baby Oksana tried to crawl into some woods, but while in the woods, she was discovered by a pack of wild dogs. You may assume these wolves would have attacked or eaten Oksana, but instead they took her in as one of their own and raised her like a wolf. She lived with these wild wolves for 5 years. That was until she was found by humans who were hiking in the woods. By the time Oksana was rescued, she couldn't speak. All she could do was bark and run around on all fours. Eventually, Oksana was taken into foster care. She was taught how to walk and also how to speak. She's now an adult, but sadly never became fully normal again. You could say she's still got that dog in her, but jokes aside, she does still exhibit animal behavior, and only has the brain capacity of a 6-year-old. It is sad Oksana will never be the same again, but at least these wild dogs literally did save her life. There's no way a 3-year-old would have survived in the woods alone. Moving on, let's look at Riker Webb. In 2022, Riker Webb was reported missing from his home. The red-headed toddler had been walking around in the woods near his family's cabin, but he wandered off into the woods and got lost. He was missing alone for 2 days in rural Montana, in an area inhabited by mountain lions and bears. There were also severe thunderstorms, and the temperature was only 40 degrees Fahrenheit. A search party went out to try and find the boy, and after hours of calling Riker's name, they finally heard him shout back. He was very scared and clearly shaken by the experience, but Riker was unharmed and was soon reunited with his parents. Authorities still want to know why Riker's parents took 2 hours to report him missing, but the important thing is this boy is safe, despite his harrowing experience. Moving on, let's look at Robert McDonough. In 2013, Robert McDonough disappeared from his home in Maine. The elderly man had dementia, so naturally his family were very worried. Authorities searched the area but found no trace of Robert. But as a news crew was reporting on his disappearance, Robert casually walked into the frame of the news report. Robert was totally unaware of everything and didn't even know he'd been missing. Thankfully, Robert was totally unharmed. He'd simply wandered into the adjacent forest near his home, somehow avoiding the search team's efforts. Moving on, we have to look at Julian Hernandez. In 2002, Bobby Hernandez abducted his son Julian, only leaving behind a note for Julian's mother. For 13 years, Bobby and Julian lived under fake identities in Ohio, very far away from where they used to live in Alabama. But in 2015, when Julian applied for college, a school counselor discovered his missing status. The school counselor called the police, meaning that Julian was finally reunited with his mother. Julian's father, Bobby, was sentenced to 4 years in prison. But surprisingly, Julian said he forgives his dad, despite them living a lie for 13 years. Next, let's look at Nguyen Thi Van. One evening, 16-year-old Nguyen Thi Van from Vietnam was out late. Because she came home late, her mother locked her out. So instead, Nguyen went to a karaoke bar. That's where she met a man who trafficked her to China. In China, Nguyen was forced into marriage, and was married for 21 years before making her escape. When she returned, she was reunited with her parents, who I'm sure regretted locking her out that night. It's crazy that she was gone for over 2 decades, but thankfully now lives a normal and happy life in Vietnam. Next, we have to look at JC Dugard. In 1991, 11-year-old JC Dugard was kidnapped. She was taken by a man named Philip Garrido. While in captivity, JC would give birth to 2 of Philip's daughters. She experienced Stockholm Syndrome and believed she was in love with Philip. In 2009, Philip went to a college campus with his and JC's daughters. Philip was accompanied by a woman who was later identified as JC. Police went to search Philip Garrido's home, and behind his house they found many sheds and tents, which is where JC and her daughters had been kept. Philip's house was known as the House of Horrors, and to this day is censored on Google Maps for this reason. Thankfully, JC was rescued and taken back to her family. JC was taken when she was only 11 years old, and spent 18 years in captivity, meaning that she was now 29 when she was found again. Despite these horrible years of her life, JC now lives happily. Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years behind bars, and Philip's wife, Nancy, was sentenced to 36 years. This was for helping Philip hold JC captive. Moving on, let's look at Petra Pasieka. In 1984, Petra Pasieka failed to show up for her brother's birthday. This led to her family believing that she'd been kidnapped. A man confessed to her murder and the case was closed in 1989. But in 2015, during a burglary investigation in Düsseldorf, Germany, a woman going by the name Mrs. Schneider revealed herself to be Petra Pasieka. It turned out Petra had not been murdered after all. Instead, an innocent man had been convicted for her murder. Petra had simply been living in Germany under a fake name, and had been keeping up the charade for over 30 years. Moving on, let's look at Savannah Todd. In 1994, Savannah Todd's parents divorced. Savannah Todd's father won custody, so in response, Savannah's mother Dorothy kidnapped her. They fled from New Zealand to South Carolina, USA, and lived under fake names. Savannah's mother remarried. Savannah was raised to believe that her stepfather was her biological father, but in 2011 the truth emerged when her mother Dorothy confessed. Dorothy was arrested and sentenced to prison time, while Savannah was reunited with her biological father named Ben. Finally, let's look at Timothy Carney. In 2004, Timothy Carney vanished. For nearly 7 years, Timothy's parents searched for him. Finally, on September 23, 2011, Timothy was found safe, but he didn't want to talk very much about where he was for all those years. His parents believed he'd fallen in with a cult named Gospel Outreach, but exactly why Timothy went missing for 7 years is still unexplained to this day. Now it's time for you to make your voice heard. Comment below which of these stories was the most mind-blowing. If you want to see my short videos, then check out my second channel. I've been Charlie. Thanks for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and if you haven't already, then what are you waiting for? Subscribe to Top 10s.